This was back when I was in high school. I was a pretty average student, kept to myself mostly, and had a small group of close friends. I was never one to get into trouble or have drama in my life. Things were generally smooth sailing, which is why what happened caught me so off guard. It started on a random Tuesday morning. I remember it was a cloudy day and I wasn't particularly excited about going to school. I went through my usual routine, got ready, and headed out. When I got to school, everything was normal. Same faces, same routine. I went to my locker to grab my books for my first class, and that's when I noticed something odd. There was a small piece of paper sticking out of the edge of my locker door. It looked like someone had slipped it through the crack. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd often leave notes for each other, so I figured it was from one of my friends, but when I pulled it out and unfolded it, I realized it wasn't from anyone I knew. The note was handwritten in small, neat letters. It said, "I know what you did." I just stared at it for a moment, trying to process what it meant. At first, I thought it had to be a joke. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me, trying to freak me out. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There wasn't anything I'd done that someone could hold against me. I wasn't involved in any drama, hadn't gotten into any trouble recently, and had no secrets that would warrant a note like that. I crumpled up the note and tossed it in the trash, trying to brush it off. I figured it was just someone being stupid or trying to scare me for fun. But as the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who would leave something like that in my locker? And what were they talking about? The next day, I almost forgot about the note. I went about my day as usual, trying not to let it bother me. But when I went to my locker again in the morning, there was another note. This time, it was tucked inside my locker, right on top of my books. It was the same neat handwriting, but the message was different. This one said, "You can't hide from the truth." That's when I started to get really freaked out. Someone was definitely messing with me, and it wasn't funny anymore. I started thinking back to the day before, trying to remember if I'd seen anyone near my locker or acting suspicious, but nothing came to mind. I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. I showed the note to one of my friends, hoping they'd confess to the prank, but they swore they didn't know anything about it. They even seemed genuinely concerned, which only made me more uneasy. I thought about reporting it to a teacher or the school counselor, but it seemed like such a small thing, just a couple of notes. I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to find someone watching me or following me, but everything seemed normal. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I tried to focus on my homework and forget about the notes, but it was hard to concentrate. The next morning, I was dreading going to school. I was almost afraid to open my locker, but I had to know if there was another note. Sure enough, there was. This one was different, though. It wasn't a vague message like the others. It was specific. It mentioned something I'd done the day before, something so ordinary that no one should have noticed or cared about. It said, "Nice job pretending you didn't see me." I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever was doing this wasn't just leaving random notes. They were watching me. They knew my routine, knew what I was doing, and they were making sure I knew they were watching. I started to panic, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? Was it someone from my class? Someone I passed in the hallway? I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. For the rest of the day, I was on edge. Every time someone looked at me, I wondered if they were the one leaving the notes. I barely spoke to anyone, just going through the motions and trying to get through the day. I avoided my locker as much as possible, not wanting to see another note, but I knew I'd have to check eventually. When the final bell rang, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I didn't want to go to my locker, but I also couldn't leave without my books. I walked slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my locker, I hesitated for a moment before opening it. There, right on top of my books, was another note. This one was the worst yet. It said, "You can't keep ignoring me." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the note, stuffed it in my pocket, and slammed my locker shut. I didn't care about my books or homework. I just wanted to get out of there. I left school as fast as I could, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who was doing this to me and why? What did they want? When I got home, I locked myself in my room and pulled out all the notes. I spread them out on my bed, reading them over and over, trying to find some clue that would tell me who was behind it, but there was nothing. No name, no handwriting that I recognized, nothing. I felt helpless, like I was being hunted by someone I couldn't see. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside my window made me jump, and I kept imagining someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew I had to tell someone, but I didn't know who to trust. I didn't want to involve my parents. They just worry and might even make things worse by contacting the school. But I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. The next day, I decided to confront one of my friends who I thought might be involved. I didn't accuse them directly, but I asked if they knew anything about the notes or if they'd seen anyone near my locker. They looked at me like I was crazy and swore they had no idea what I was talking about. I believed them, but that only made me feel more isolated. By this point, I was constantly on edge. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt like someone was watching me. I started avoiding certain areas of the school, taking different routes to my classes, and even skipping lunch so I wouldn't have to be around too many people. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I couldn't help it. The fear was taking over. The notes kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. They mentioned things I'd done at home, private moments that no one should have known about. Someone was watching me, not just at school, but outside of it too. I felt like there was no escape, no way to get away from whoever was tormenting me. I finally broke down and went to the school counselor. I showed them the notes and explained what had been happening. They took it seriously, which was a relief, but they didn't have any immediate answers. They promised to look into it, but they also warned me not to engage with the person leaving the notes and to stay vigilant. For a while, things seemed to calm down. I didn't find any new notes in my locker, and I started to relax a little. Then, just when I was starting to think it was over, I found one last note. This one wasn't in my locker. It was in my backpack, hidden in a place I never would have looked if I hadn't needed something from the bottom of the bag. The note was simple, just one line. "You won't see me coming." That was the last straw. I didn't go back to the counselor. I didn't tell my friends, I just shut down. I started going through the motions, barely talking to anyone, just trying to get through each day without breaking down. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. Whoever was doing this was playing a game, and I felt like I was losing. In the end, the notes just stopped. I never found out who was behind it or why they did it. I want to share something that happened to me a couple of years ago when I was still in high school. It was just a regular school day. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. I was a junior, and I had a pretty standard routine. Wake up, get ready, head to school, go to classes, and so on. This particular day, I remember being in a rush because I had a lot on my mind. Assignments, an upcoming test, and just the usual stress of being a high school student. I remember the morning being a bit chaotic. I barely made it to school on time, and as soon as I got to my first class, I realized I'd forgotten to pack my lunch. Not a huge deal, but annoying enough to throw me off a little. I went through my classes as usual, and by the time lunch rolled around, I was starving. I left my backpack in the classroom, figuring I'd be back in 30 minutes, and headed to the cafeteria to grab something to eat. Lunch was uneventful, just me and a few friends talking about random stuff, trying to ignore the fact that we'd have to get back to classes soon. After lunch, I made my way back to the classroom to grab my backpack before heading to my next period. But when I got there, my backpack was gone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I'd left it somewhere else by mistake, or maybe someone had moved it as a prank. I checked around the classroom, under desks, in the corners, and even in the hallway outside, but it was nowhere to be found. I started to get annoyed, thinking one of my friends was messing with me. I texted a few of them, but no one responded right away. I decided to check the lost and found. even though it seemed unlikely that my backpack would have ended up there so quickly. The lost and found was just a small room near the front office, filled with the usual assortment of jackets, notebooks, and random items students left behind. But my backpack wasn't there either. The person in charge of the lost and found hadn't seen it and suggested I check with my teacher to see if anyone had turned it in. I went back to the classroom and asked my teacher if anyone had picked up my backpack or turned it into them, but they said no. By this point, I was getting frustrated. It wasn't just about the backpack itself, it was everything inside it. My textbooks, notebooks, assignments, all the things I needed for my classes. I couldn't afford to lose any of that, especially with a big test coming up. I decided to retrace my steps, thinking maybe I'd left it somewhere on the way to lunch. I walked the path I'd taken earlier, checking the hallways, the cafeteria, and even the bathrooms, but it was nowhere. As I was walking back to the classroom, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, a single pen lying on the floor near a bench in the hallway. It was one of those cheap pens that you get in bulk, but I recognized it immediately. It was from my backpack. I picked up the pen, trying to figure out how it had gotten there. Maybe it had fallen out earlier and I hadn't noticed, but that didn't explain where the rest of my stuff was. I kept looking around, starting to feel a bit uneasy. The school was busy, with students moving between classes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the day went on, I kept finding more of my things scattered around the school. My calculator was on a windowsill in the library. One of my notebooks was lying on a bench near the gym. My water bottle was in a hallway I hadn't even been down that day. It was like someone was deliberately spreading my stuff around, but I couldn't figure out why or who would do something like that. The weirdest part was that no one seemed to notice. I asked a few people if they'd seen anyone carrying my backpack or dropping my things, but no one had. It was like the stuff was just appearing out of nowhere. By the time school ended, I was really stressed out. I hadn't found my backpack, and I was missing a lot of important things. After my last class, I decided to check one last place, the school courtyard. It was a small enclosed area with a few benches and some trees where students sometimes hung out between classes. I didn't really expect to find anything there, but at this point I was desperate. As soon as I walked into the courtyard, I spotted something that made my heart skip a beat. My backpack sitting on one of the benches. I rushed over to it, half expecting it to disappear as soon as I got close, but it didn't. It was definitely my backpack, and it looked completely normal. I grabbed it and quickly unzipped it to check inside. Everything was there. My textbooks, my notebooks, even the things I'd already found scattered around the school. It was like nothing had ever happened. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt more confused than ever. I couldn't figure out how my backpack had ended up there or why someone would go to the trouble of taking it and then spreading my stuff all over the school, only to return it in the end. It didn't make any sense. I took my backpack and headed home, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. I told myself it was just a prank, maybe someone's idea of a joke, but it didn't feel like one. When I got home, I didn't mention anything to my parents. I figured they'd just tell me I was being paranoid, and maybe I was. But that night I had trouble sleeping, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and why. The next day at school, everything was normal. My backpack was still with me, nothing missing, nothing out of place. I didn't find any more of my stuff lying around, and no one said anything about the day before. I asked around a bit, trying to see if anyone knew anything, but no one did. It was like the whole thing had never happened. Back in high school, I was on the basketball team. I wasn't the best player, but I loved the game. There was something about the empty gym, just me and the hoop, that felt almost therapeutic. I'd stay late after practice sometimes, working on my shots, running drills, or just shooting around to clear my head. One evening, it was getting close to winter, and the days were getting shorter. It was one of those chilly afternoons where the sun sets earlier than expected, and by the time practice ended, it was already dark outside. My teammates had all left and I decided to stay behind for a bit to work on my free throws. The gym was completely empty, which was something I was used to and even enjoyed. It was just me, the squeak of my sneakers on the polished floor, and the occasional thud of the ball against the backboard. I lost track of time as I often did, getting into that zone where everything else just fades away. I think I had been at it for about an hour when I suddenly heard a loud bang echo through the gym. I froze, the ball bouncing away from me and rolling to a stop. It was the sound of the gym doors slamming shut. My first thought was that the janitor had come to lock up, not realizing I was still inside. It wouldn't have been the first time. I jogged over to the doors to explain I was still there, but when I got there, the doors were shut tight. I pulled on them, expecting them to open easily, but they didn't budge. The realization hit me that I was locked inside. I tried not to panic. The school wasn't huge, and I figured if I knocked on the doors or made enough noise, someone would eventually hear me. I started banging on the doors, calling out, but the only response was my voice echoing back at me. The gym was on the far end of the school, away from most of the classrooms and offices, so it wasn't like there would be people passing by who could hear me. I kept telling myself it was fine, that someone would come around eventually. But as the minutes ticked by, my confidence started to wane. I checked my pockets, realizing my phone was in my locker, which was down the hall in the locker room. I had no way to call for help, and the reality of the situation started to set in. I was alone, locked in the gym, and it was getting late. The temperature inside the gym had started to drop, and I could see my breath in the cold air. I tried to think logically. The janitor would have to do his rounds eventually, and he'd notice the gym lights were still on, right? I started to pace, trying to keep warm and keep my mind off the growing sense of unease. The gym was a big space, and the only light was from the overhead fluorescents, which cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. Every small sound, every creak of the building settling seemed amplified in the stillness. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but that didn't stop the hair on the back of my neck from standing up. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to try the doors again. Maybe they were just stuck. I threw my weight against them, hoping they'd give way, but they didn't move an inch. I checked the other exits, but they were all the same, locked tight. There was no way out. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I started to feel genuinely scared. The idea of spending the night locked in the gym was becoming a real possibility, and I wasn't sure I could handle that. That's when I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the building creaking, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but they were there, coming from somewhere outside the gym. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they'd started. I was freaking out at this point, not sure if my mind was playing tricks on me or if there was actually someone there. I walked to the middle of the court, where I could see all the exits clearly. I figured if someone was messing with me, they'd have to show themselves eventually. I stood there, trying to keep my breathing steady, but the silence was almost deafening. I kept glancing around, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to try the windows. There were a few along the top of the gym walls, but they were small and high up, definitely not meant to be an escape route. Still, I was desperate. I grabbed a chair from the side of the court and dragged it over to the wall. Climbing up, I tried to push one of the windows open, but it wouldn't budge. I was about to give up when I noticed one of the windows had a tiny crack in it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let in a bit of cold air. I managed to pry it open just enough to fit my hand through, but there was no way I could squeeze out that way. Feeling completely helpless, I sat down on the bleachers, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I heard the footsteps again, this time louder and closer. They weren't just outside the gym. They were in the hallway, right outside the doors. I felt my stomach drop, and I knew I had to do something. I ran to the doors again, banging on them as hard as I could, yelling for help. But the footsteps just stopped, and I was met with silence once more. I was panicking now, convinced that someone was out there watching me. The thought of spending the night alone in the gym with whoever or whatever was out there was unbearable. I started thinking about all the horror stories I had heard, about people going missing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen if I didn't get out of there. I decided to try the windows one last time. Maybe if I could get them open a little more, I could call for help or at least get some fresh air. I climbed back up on the chair, using all my strength to push against the window. To my surprise, it gave way a little more, just enough for me to squeeze my head and shoulders through. It was a tight fit, and I had to contort my body in awkward angles, but I managed to slide through, my feet dangling a few feet off the ground outside. I dropped to the ground, my heart racing as I took a moment to catch my breath. I was finally out. The cold night air hit me and I felt a rush of relief. I didn't waste any time. I ran around to the front of the school, hoping to find anyone who could help. But the school grounds were deserted. It was late and everyone had gone home. My only option was to walk home, which wasn't too far, but every step I took, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The next day at school, everything seemed normal. I didn't mention what had happened to anyone, not even my friends. I went to the gym after class to check, and sure enough, the doors were unlocked and everything was as it should be. It was like nothing had ever happened. I want to share something that happened to me a couple of years ago. It was just a regular day, nothing special. I was sitting in class waiting for our usual teacher to arrive, but instead a substitute walked in. This wasn't unusual. Teachers get sick, have personal days, whatever. The substitute was a man I'd never seen before, which was odd because we usually had the same few subs rotating through the school. He looked pretty unremarkable, middle-aged with glasses and a neat suit. He introduced himself, but I don't remember his name. The day was going along fine, just the usual routine stuff until the substitute handed out an assignment. It was different from anything we'd done before, and it immediately struck me as weird. He asked us to write an essay about our deepest fear. Not just a short paragraph, but a detailed essay. He wanted us to really dig into it, describe it, explain why it scared us, how it made us feel. At first, I thought it was a strange topic for an assignment, especially since it didn't seem to tie into the subject we were studying. But I didn't think too much of it. I figured it was just busy work to keep us occupied while our regular teacher was out. Most of the other students looked as confused as I felt, but we all started writing anyway. I didn't have any particular fear that stood out to me, so I ended up writing about something generic, like a fear of heights. It felt like the kind of thing the sub wanted, so I went with it. The atmosphere in the room was odd while we worked. The sub was really quiet, just sitting at the desk at the front of the room, occasionally glancing up at us. There was something about his presence that made me feel uneasy, like he was studying us or trying to get inside our heads. I tried to ignore it and focused on my essay, wanting to get it done so I could move on with my day. After we finished, he collected our essays and we moved on to the next subject. The rest of the day went by without incident, and by the time I got home, I'd almost forgotten about the assignment. The next day, our regular teacher was back, and everything seemed back to normal. A few days later, the essays were returned to us, but with something unexpected. Instead of the usual corrections or comments about our writing, there were these strange personal comments written in the margins. They were specific, way too specific, and it wasn't just on my paper, it was on everyone's. My essay on the fear of heights had a comment next to it that said something like, "You've always been afraid of falling, haven't you? Not just from heights, but in life too. Afraid of failing. Afraid of not being enough." I remember reading that and feeling a chill run down my spine. It was like the sub had read more into my essay than I'd intended. Like he understood something about me that I hadn't even realized. I looked around the classroom, and I could see that other students were just as freaked out as I was. A couple of them exchanged nervous glances, and one girl even whispered something to her friend, looking pale and shaken. The comments on their papers must have been just as unsettling. After class, a few of us started talking about it, trying to make sense of what had happened. We all had the same reaction. How could this substitute, someone who didn't know us at all, make such personal, almost invasive comments? It didn't make any sense. We started wondering if the sub had somehow found out things about us beforehand, but that seemed impossible. There wasn't anything in our essays that should have prompted the kind of responses he gave. The more we talked, the more we started to piece together that something wasn't right. We decided to ask our regular teacher about the sub, thinking maybe he had some explanation, but when we did, he looked at us like we were crazy. He said that no substitute had been scheduled to cover his class. That's when things really started to feel off. If there wasn't supposed to be a substitute, then who was the man who'd taken our class that day? And how had he gotten access to our classroom, to the school in general? We went to the office to ask about him, but the staff there didn't have any record of a substitute being assigned to our class on that day. They said it must have been a mix-up, but the more we pushed, the more they just shrugged it off, like it wasn't a big deal. After that, things got weird in a different way. A few of the students who had been in class that day started getting phone calls at home. It was always the same, late at night, from a blocked number, and no one on the other end when they answered. Just silence, or sometimes a faint rustling sound. It didn't happen every night, but often enough that it started to feel like more than a coincidence. Eventually, the phone calls stopped, and the sightings became less frequent, but the fear never really went away. It was like we were all waiting for something else to happen, something worse. But nothing did. The school year ended and we moved on, but the memory of that substitute and what he'd done stayed with us. This happened when I was in high school. It was just a typical year, nothing particularly special about it. I was focused on getting through classes, hanging out with friends, and dealing with the usual teenage stuff. My life was pretty routine, and I liked it that way. One day, though, something strange started happening. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had just finished a big test that I'd been stressing over. After school, I went to my locker to grab my things before heading home. As I opened my locker, a piece of paper fluttered to the ground. I thought it was just some scrap I'd shoved in there and forgotten about, but when I picked it up, I realized it was a note. It was just a small piece of lined paper folded into a tight square. I unfolded it, expecting to see some random doodles or maybe a message from a friend, but it wasn't anything like that. It was a note written in neat, small handwriting. The words were simple but unsettling. It said something like, "I've been watching you." My first thought was that it was a joke, maybe one of my friends messing with me. But there was something about the handwriting that didn't seem familiar. It wasn't sloppy or rushed like you'd expect from a prank note. It looked deliberate, careful. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just someone trying to get a reaction out of me. I crumpled up the note and tossed it in the trash, not giving it much more thought. I figured that would be the end of it. The next day, I found another note in my locker. This one was even more specific. It mentioned something I'd done the day before, something really small and mundane, like where I'd gone for lunch or the fact that I'd stopped to tie my shoe in the hallway. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Whoever was leaving these notes wasn't just guessing or playing around. They were actually watching me. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, trying to figure out who could be doing this. But no one stood out. My friends all acted normal, and no one seemed to be watching me any more than usual. I thought about asking them if they were behind the notes, but I didn't want to sound paranoid or give them the satisfaction if they were just messing with me. The notes kept coming, though, and each one got a little more personal, a little more invasive. They mentioned things that no one should have known about, things that I hadn't told anyone. Like the fact that I always took the long way home because I liked the quiet, or how I had a habit of checking my reflection in the windows as I walked by. These were things that were too specific to be random guesses. After about a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I was constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder, trying to figure out who was doing this and why. I started getting paranoid, wondering if someone was following me, if they were lurking around every corner. It got to the point where I didn't want to be at school anymore because I felt like I couldn't escape it. One day, after finding yet another note in my locker, I decided to go to the school office. I brought the notes with me, hoping they could help me figure out who was behind this. The secretary looked concerned and said she'd pass the notes on to the principal, but I could tell she didn't really know what to do. It wasn't like they could launch an investigation over some creepy notes. I hoped that reporting it would at least make the notes stop, but instead, things got worse. The day after I went to the office, I found another note in my locker. But this one wasn't like the others. It was different, more threatening. I remember feeling a wave of panic when I read it. Whoever was doing this knew I'd gone to the office and they didn't like it. It made me feel even more trapped, like there was no way out of this situation. I started avoiding my locker, only going there when I absolutely had to, and even then, I'd approach it with dread, half expecting to find another note. But the notes didn't stop. Instead, they started appearing in other places. I found one slipped into my textbook, another tucked into my jacket pocket. One even showed up in my backpack, which I knew I'd had with me the whole time. It was like this person was everywhere, always one step ahead of me. I started feeling like I couldn't trust anyone. I pulled away from my friends. I felt isolated, alone with this growing fear that I couldn't shake. After a particularly bad day, when I'd found 2 notes in one afternoon, I finally broke down and told my parents. They were worried, of course, but like the school, they didn't really know what to do. My dad suggested we go to the police, but I was too scared that whoever was doing this would find out and escalate things even further. In the end, we decided to just keep a closer eye on things, hoping it would blow over, but it didn't. The notes kept coming, and each one seemed more menacing than the last. The final straw came one evening when I was getting ready for bed. I was in my room trying to relax and put the day behind me when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, and the message was short. Nice pajamas. I felt like my blood turned to ice. The only way someone could know what I was wearing was if they were outside my house watching me. I rushed to my window and looked out, but there was no one there, just the empty street and the darkened houses of my neighbors. I felt exposed, like I was being watched from every angle. That night, my parents and I decided that it was time to go to the police, no matter what the consequences might be. I couldn't keep living like this, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next note to appear. The police took it seriously, thankfully. They started an investigation, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They told me to be vigilant, to report anything unusual, and they promised to keep an eye on things. After that, the notes stopped. It was like the person behind them knew the police were involved and decided to back off. I never found out who it was or why they targeted me. The police couldn't trace the number that had sent the text, and there were no leads to follow. One evening, I stayed late after school to work on a project. It was for one of my classes that required a lot of research, and I liked to use the school library because it was quiet and had everything I needed. The library was pretty much deserted after school hours, which was fine by me. I worked better when it was quiet. I remember it was getting late, probably around 6 or 7 p.m., and the sun was already setting. The library was one of those older ones with tall wooden bookshelves and narrow aisles. The kind of place that always smelled a bit musty no matter how much they cleaned. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead, casting a harsh white light over the tables and shelves. I was sitting at one of the tables near the back, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. The librarian had left a while ago, so I was the only one there. The silence was comforting at first, helping me focus on the work I needed to get done. But as the hours passed, the quiet started to feel a little oppressive. I could hear every creak of the building, every rustle of paper, and even the sound of my own breathing. After a while, I decided to take a break and stretch my legs. I got up and started wandering around the library, absent-mindedly browsing the shelves. As I walked, I started hearing something faint, a soft whispering sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I moved closer to the back of the library, the whispering got louder. It was weird, but I wasn't too concerned at that point. I figured it was just some noise from outside or maybe the ventilation system acting up. I kept walking, moving toward the farthest corner of the library where the older, less used books were stored. The whispering grew louder as I approached, and I could start to make out what sounded like actual words, though I couldn't understand them. That's when I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just random noise anymore. There was something deliberate about it, something that didn't feel right. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, maybe just my mind playing tricks on me after hours of studying. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to turn around and head back to my table. But as I started to walk away, the whispering seemed to follow me. It was still faint, but it was definitely there, and it seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. But there was no one else in the library. I was completely alone. I stood there for a minute, listening. The whispering continued, soft and insistent, but I still couldn't make out what it was saying. It was like it was just out of reach, taunting me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just some random noise, there was something wrong here. I decided I'd had enough and quickly walked back to my table. I gathered my things, stuffing my books and papers into my backpack as fast as I could. The whispering seemed to get louder as I packed up, almost like it was protesting that I was leaving. I didn't dare look back as I headed for the door. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it clearly for the first time. My name. It was unmistakable, spoken in a low, raspy whisper that sent a jolt of fear through me. I froze, my hand on the door handle, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the dimly lit library. There was nothing there, no one standing behind me, no one hiding in the shadows. But the whispering continued, repeating my name over and over again like it was coming from the walls themselves. It was disorienting, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I bolted. I yanked the door open and practically ran out of the library, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders as I raced down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside. I felt like I'd just escaped something terrible, something I couldn't fully understand. I never went back to the library after that. A few years ago, something happened at my school that I still think about to this day. It was my senior year of high school. I was pretty focused on finishing up classes, applying to colleges, and just getting through the year without too much drama. There was one teacher in particular that I really liked, Mr. Daniels. He taught history, and he was one of those teachers who actually made the subject interesting. He was laid back, funny, and you could tell he genuinely cared about his students. His class was one of the few I looked forward to. Then one day, out of nowhere, he stopped showing up to school. It was weird because he hadn't mentioned anything about taking time off, and there hadn't been any rumors or gossip about him leaving. The first day he was gone, we had a substitute who didn't really know what was going on. She just told us that Mr. Daniels was out and that she'd be covering for him for the day. At first, we all assumed he was just sick or maybe dealing with a family emergency. But as the days turned into a week, and then another week, it became clear that something else was going on. The substitute didn't have any answers for us, and when we asked other teachers, they just said they didn't know anything either. The whole situation felt off. Mr. Daniels wasn't the kind of teacher who would just disappear without telling anyone what was going on. He was too responsible, too dedicated. I started to get this uneasy feeling, like there was more to the story than we were being told. After a couple of weeks, the substitute who had been covering for him was replaced by another one, and then another. It was like they couldn't find anyone to stick around permanently. Each new sub was less informed than the last, and none of them seemed to have any idea where Mr. Daniels had gone or when, if ever, he was coming back. That's when the rumors started. Some kids said he had quit suddenly, fed up with the administration. Others claimed he'd been fired for something, though no one could agree on what. There were even a few wild stories about him being involved in something shady outside of school, but none of it felt right. I didn't believe any of the rumors, but the lack of information was frustrating, and it just added to the strange atmosphere. Then one day, after school, a few friends and I were hanging out, and the conversation turned to Mr. Daniels. We were all curious about what had happened to him, and one of my friends, let's call him Matt, suggested that we try to find out for ourselves. Matt was always the adventurous type, the one who would come up with crazy ideas just for the thrill of it. He suggested we sneak into Mr. Daniels' office to see if we could find any clues about where he had gone. At first, I thought it was a terrible idea. Breaking into a teacher's office sounded like a good way to get into serious trouble, but the more we talked about it, the more it started to seem like our only chance to get some answers. Besides, the school was pretty much deserted after hours, and we figured we could get in and out without anyone noticing. So that evening, we waited until the school was empty. We knew that the custodians would be making their rounds, but the building was big, and we figured we could avoid them if we were careful. We made our way to the history department, sticking to the shadows and trying to keep as quiet as possible. When we reached Mr. Daniels' office, we were surprised to find that the door was already slightly ajar. That should have been our first warning sign, but we were too focused on our mission to really think about it. We slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind us. The office was small, with a desk, a few chairs, and shelves lined with books and papers. It looked like it had been hastily abandoned. There were papers scattered across the desk, and a few personal items like photos and a coffee mug were still there. We started looking through the papers, hoping to find something that would give us a clue about where he had gone. But the more we looked, the more it became clear that there was nothing there. No notes, no letters, nothing that explained his sudden disappearance. It was like he had just walked out one day and never come back. Then Matt noticed something. One of the desk drawers was slightly open, and when he pulled it out all the way, we saw a small locked box inside. It was one of those metal cash boxes you might use to store valuables. Of course, the lock only made us more curious. Matt, being Matt, immediately started trying to pick the lock with a paperclip he'd found on the desk. I was getting more nervous by the minute. The whole situation was starting to feel wrong. We were snooping through a teacher's private things, and for what? But before I could say anything, Matt managed to pop the lock open. He grinned and opened the box, and what we found inside made my blood run cold. There were a few items in the box: a small notebook, a couple of USB drives, and a set of keys. But it was the notebook that caught our attention first. Matt flipped it open, and we saw that it was filled with Mr. Daniels' handwriting. It looked like a journal of some kind, but as we started to read, it became clear that this wasn't just any journal. The entries were scattered, disjointed, like they'd been written in a hurry or under stress. They talked about someone following him, watching him. He wrote about feeling like he was being monitored, even in his own home. The more we read, the more paranoid and frantic the entries became. He mentioned seeing strange people outside his house, receiving phone calls, and finding things in his home moved around or missing entirely. It was disturbing, to say the least. This was a side of Mr. Daniels that none of us had ever seen. He had always been so calm and collected, but the person who wrote these entries was terrified, on the verge of breaking down. I remember feeling a pit in my stomach as I realized that whatever had happened to him, it wasn't just some sudden decision to leave. Something had driven him away, something that had made him feel like he was in danger. We all just stared at the pages, trying to process what we were reading. Who was he talking about? What had happened to him? And why had he left this notebook behind? None of it made any sense. Just as we were starting to discuss what to do next, we heard a noise outside the office. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway. We all froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The footsteps got closer and I could see the shadow of someone moving outside the frosted glass window of the office door. We didn't have time to think. Matt quickly shut the box and stuffed it back into the drawer, while the rest of us tried to make it look like we hadn't been there. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I held my breath, waiting for whoever it was to come in. But they didn't. Instead, we heard the sound of keys jingling, and then the door handle turned slowly. That was enough for us. We bolted for the other door in the office, the one that led to the back hallway. We didn't wait to see who was trying to get in. We just ran. We raced through the empty halls, not daring to look back, until we finally burst out into the night. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the school, gasping for breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. After that night, none of us wanted to talk about what we had found. We were all shaken, and the more we thought about it, the more we realized how much trouble we could get into if anyone found out what we'd done. But more than that, we were scared. Scared of what had happened to Mr. Daniels, and scared of what we had almost walked into that night. We never did find out what happened to him. The school never gave us any answers, and as the weeks went by, it became clear that he wasn't coming back. Eventually, they replaced him with a new teacher, and life at school went on as if nothing had happened.
This was back when I was in high school. I was a junior, and like a lot of kids, I didn't pay much attention to the people who worked at the school, unless I had to interact with them. You know how it is, you have your friends, your teachers, and then there's everyone else who just blends into the background. One of those people was the custodian. I don't know exactly when he started working at the school. He just sort of appeared one day, and no one really thought much of it. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with graying hair and a permanent frown. He wasn't the friendliest guy, but then again, most custodians aren't exactly chatty, so I didn't think much of it at first. But after a while, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't anything big, just little things that added up over time. Like how he always seemed to be around no matter where I was in the school. I'd see him in the hallways during class, in the cafeteria during lunch, and even outside near the parking lot after school. It was like he was everywhere, always lurking just on the edge of my vision. At first, I figured it was just a coincidence. Schools aren't that big, and custodians have to move around to do their jobs, right? But it started to feel like more than that. I began to notice how his eyes would follow me as I walked past him, how he always seemed to be watching, even when I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't just me either. My friends noticed it too. We'd joke about it sometimes, saying that he was the school's unofficial security guard. But deep down, it bothered me. One day after school, I stayed late to work on a project. The school was mostly empty, with just a few students and teachers still around. I was in the art room, which was on the far side of the building, away from most of the other classrooms. I liked working there because it was quiet and I could focus without any distractions. I'd been there for about an hour when I realized I was out of supplies. I needed more paint, which was stored in a supply closet down the hall. I left my stuff in the art room and went to get what I needed. The hallways were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound echo and seem louder than it actually is. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned the corner and saw him, the custodian, at the other end of the hallway. He was just standing there, facing away from me, like he was waiting for something. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't fully understand. There was nothing inherently scary about the guy, but something about the way he was just standing there, motionless, made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off and continued walking toward the supply closet, hoping he wouldn't turn around. But as I got closer, he suddenly moved. He didn't turn around or acknowledge me in any way. He just started walking in the same direction I was heading, down the hallway toward the supply closet.
It felt like he was deliberately blocking my path, like he wanted to make me uncomfortable. I stopped again, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to turn back and look like I was running away, but I also didn't want to follow him. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a detour through one of the side hallways that led back to the art room. I figured I could wait until he was gone and then go back to get the supplies. I hurried back to the art room, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I got there, I closed the door behind me and locked it, just to be safe. I sat down at my desk, trying to calm down and convince myself that I was overreacting. But as I sat there, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I'd left the door unlocked when I went to get the supplies. Anyone could have walked in while I was gone. I hurried back to the art room, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I got there, I closed the door behind me and locked it, just to be safe. I sat down at my desk, trying to calm down and convince myself that I was overreacting. But as I sat there, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I'd left the door unlocked when I went to get the supplies. Anyone could have walked in while I was gone. I quickly scanned the room, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. But the room was empty, just like I'd left it. I let out a shaky breath and tried to focus on my project, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every little creak of the building made me jump. After what felt like an eternity, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and headed for the door. I was ready to get out of there and go home where I could finally relax. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway toward the art room. I stood there, my hand hovering over the door handle, listening as the footsteps got closer. They stopped right outside the door, and for a moment everything was silent again. I felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck as I waited, hardly daring to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. I didn't move for a long time, too scared to open the door and see who had been out there. But eventually, I couldn't stay in the art room forever. I had to leave. I slowly unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty, no sign of anyone, not even the custodian. I took a deep breath and stepped out, keeping my eyes and ears open for any sign of movement. But the hallway remained empty and silent as I made my way to the front of the school. As I reached the front doors, I glanced back over my shoulder one last time. I half expected to see the custodian standing there, watching me, but there was no one. I pushed open the doors and stepped outside. The next day at school, I avoided the custodian as much as possible. I took different routes to class, stayed in crowded areas, and made sure I was never alone in the hallways. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always nearby, watching. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I started noticing him more and more, always in the background, always watching. He never said anything to me, never did anything overtly threatening, but his presence was enough to make me feel constantly on edge. I started dreading going to school, knowing that I'd have to see him every day. Then, a few days later, the custodian was gone. The school didn't say much about it, just that he was no longer employed there. They brought in someone new, and life at school slowly returned to normal. But even though he was gone, the memory of those weeks stayed with me. A few years ago, something happened to me that I've never really been able to shake. I had volunteered to help set up for a big event the school was hosting the next day. I don't even remember what the event was now, just that it involved a lot of decorations, tables, and general prep work. A few other students were supposed to help too, but by the time evening rolled around, most of them had bailed. That left just me and one of the teachers, Mr. Harris, to finish everything. Mr. Harris was the kind of teacher who was always involved in after-school activities. He was nice enough, but he was also pretty strict about getting things done right, which is probably why I ended up being the last student there. He wasn't going to let anyone leave until everything was perfect. It was getting late, and most of the lights in the school had been turned off. The only lights still on were in the areas we were working in, the cafeteria, the gym, and a few of the hallways in between. The rest of the building was dark and empty, and the silence was almost deafening. Every sound echoed through the halls, making the whole place feel more like a maze than a school. We had just finished setting up the last of the tables in the gym when Mr. Harris got a call on his cell phone. He stepped outside to take it, leaving me alone in the gym. I didn't mind at first. I was tired and just wanted to get everything done so I could go home. I started cleaning up the leftover supplies, putting things back where they belonged. After a few minutes, I heard something strange, a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but the sound didn't come again. I figured it was just one of the tables settling or something, so I went back to work. But then I heard it again, this time louder and closer. It wasn't a table. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway outside the gym. I stood up and walked over to the gym doors, pushing them open just a crack to peek out into the hallway. The lights were still on and the hallway was empty, just as I expected. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I stood there for a moment listening, but everything was quiet again. I told myself I was just being jumpy because the school was so empty, and I turned back to finish cleaning up. But as I did, I heard another sound, this time from the other end of the gym. It was faint, like the sound of a door creaking open, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The only other door at that end of the gym led to the maintenance hallway, which was supposed to be locked. I didn't know if Mr. Harris had come back in through that door or if someone else was there, but the thought of being alone in the gym with a stranger sent a chill down my spine. I decided to check it out, mostly to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. I walked slowly toward the back of the gym, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. When I reached the door, I pushed it open just enough to peek through the crack. The maintenance hallway was dark, the lights turned off for the night. But just as I was about to close the door, I heard it again. A faint shuffling sound, coming from somewhere deep in the hallway. At that point, every instinct was telling me to get out of there. I didn't know what was making that noise, and I didn't want to find out. I pulled the door shut and turned to leave the gym, intending to find Mr. Harris and tell him what I'd heard. But as I walked back toward the main entrance, the lights in the gym suddenly flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness so quickly that it took me a second to react. My first thought was that there had been a power outage, but I quickly realized that the hallway lights were still on. Only the gym lights had gone out, and the darkness felt thick, almost suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight app to light my way. It didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it only made the shadows seem deeper. I hurried toward the gym doors. As I reached for the door handle, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, this time much closer, like someone was right behind me. I whipped around, shining my light into the darkness, but there was no one there. The gym was empty, as far as I could see, but the feeling that someone was there with me was overwhelming. I yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my heart racing. The hallway felt almost safe in comparison to the gym, with its bright lights and familiar surroundings. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to find Mr. Harris. I started walking quickly down the hallway, heading toward the front of the school where Mr. Harris had gone to take his call. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When I finally reached the front of the school, I was relieved to see Mr. Harris standing just outside the main doors, still on his phone. I burst through the door, startling him. He hung up quickly, asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. I just told him that I needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. He looked at me with concern, but he didn't argue. He offered to drive me home, and I quickly agreed. As we drove away from the school, I kept looking back, half expecting to see something or someone following us, but there was nothing. just the dark, empty school fading into the distance. I never told Mr. Harris what happened that night. I didn't tell anyone, really. I wasn't even sure how to explain it to myself, let alone someone else.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.